Well, it's official. Tucker Carlson is, in fact, interviewing Russian President Vladimir Putin. Now, while many suspected as much due to Carlson's recent Moscow appearance, the former Fox News host released a video yesterday highlighting the reasons why he thought it was important to hear what Putin had to say. Let's take a look.
Here's why we're doing it. First, because it's our job. We're in journalism. Our duty is to inform people. 2 years into a war that's reshaping the entire world, most Americans are not informed. They have no real idea what's happening in this region, here in Russia or 600 miles away in Ukraine. But they should know. They're paying for much of it in ways they might not fully yet perceive. The war in Ukraine is a human disaster. It's left hundreds of thousands of people dead, an entire generation of young Ukrainians, and it's depopulated the largest country in Europe. But the long-term effects are even more profound. This war has utterly reshaped the global military and trade alliances, and the sanctions that followed have as well. And in total, they have upended the world economy.
Following Carlson's announcement video, many took to X to praise him for conducting the interview. Presidential hopeful RFK Jr. posted, "Mainstream media journalists have interviewed Putin many times before. The only difference now is that they can't control the narrative. Zelensky has been given numerous primetime interviews. Osama bin Laden has been interviewed before. We have a right to hear from everyone, no matter how you feel personally about them." Former GOP candidate for President Vivek Ramaswamy wrote, "Carlson is a real journalist, actual intellectual curiosity."
But not everyone was so gung-ho on Carlson's interview. CNN's Christiane Amanpour responded to accusations leveled by Carlson that he was the only Western journalist willing to talk with Putin by writing, "Does Tucker really think we journalists haven't been trying to interview President Putin every day since his full-scale invasion of Ukraine? It's absurd. We'll continue to ask for an interview, just as we have for years now." Amanpour seemed to be vindicated by the community notes under Carlson's video, which added a statement by Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov that, quote, "Mr. Carlson is not correct. In fact, there's no way he could know this. We received numerous requests for interviews with the president."
Later on in his announcement video, Carlson alleges that the Biden administration hacked into Carlson and his company's phones to get text messages and leak them to mainstream outlets to try and derail the interview. Let's take a look.
Almost 3 years ago, the Biden administration illegally spied on our text messages and then leaked the contents to their servants in the news media. They did this in order to stop a Putin interview that we were planning. Last month, we're pretty certain they did exactly the same thing once again. But this time, we came to Moscow anyway.
Yeah, look, I think there are some true points that are being made here. Of course, it's true that Zelensky has gotten a lot of softball interviews that the mainstream press should be critical of. Of course, it's true that people who are, very much publicly reviled, like Osama bin Laden and Putin, have done mainstream news interviews, and that this doesn't have to be any different. It's also true that I think that Tucker Carlson is overstating his case somewhat by saying that no one else has ever tried to interview Putin. He's the one that's been given access that others apparently have not been given access. And that does raise some questions about why it is that he's being permitted this interview and if he's going to take this opportunity to do a real substantive interview. And we can only judge that after we see the interview itself.
Yes. And there is a history, by the way, by mainstream, respected journalists of doing a little bit of, frankly, some fluff reporting in order to land the big interview with the controversial figure and then hitting them with some hard questions. That is something that is an established practice. So don't judge what's taken place yet. Judge the actual quality of the interview. I hope Tucker asks about the Wall Street Journal reporter who has been detained absolutely illegally and unfairly. I hope he asks about the humanitarian cost for Ukraine and for Russia of this war and what it will take to get Putin to meet with Zelensky or meet with intermediaries in order to bring a halt to this awful, unconscionable war, and many other questions about the regime and what's going on in Russia.
Yeah, I agree. It is interesting, these accusations now that his phone is being tapped and that messages are being leaked in order to stop the interview. Do you understand what that argument is, or how would be well tailored to actually stopping the interview from happening?
So I remember this accusation being levied that the messages were leaked in order to, I think it was in order to put pressure on Tucker's employer at the time to stop this interview. I don't know what's going on now, but I am now seeing breaking news from Brian Krasenstein, one of the high-profile account on X, saying that the European Union is said to be seeking sanctions and a travel ban against Tucker for doing the interview. So to stop him from traveling throughout the European Union, which frankly does sound like the exact sort of action the European Union would take. This very at times illiberal alliance. Obviously, their tech policies have become very much in favor of due process and civil liberties violations on COVID subjects, on some of the Israel-Palestine subjects. So that would not surprise me at all if they're taking the position that a journalist can't interview Vladimir Putin. Obviously, within Ukraine, we've covered how Zelensky himself has taken steps to eliminate the free press in the country.
Journalists actually died in custody.
There was just, I might talk about it. I might do a radar on it for tomorrow. I don't know, but I'll mention it briefly if I don't end up mentioning it again. There was recently reporting that an actor who had been cast, a Russian actor who had been cast in the third season of The White Lotus. We're both fans of that show, I think. The Ukrainian government put pressure on HBO to fire him, and they did so, ostensibly for like pro-Russian statements he'd made. You can't find a single pro-Russian statement of this person. It's just banal. The violence is bad, and I hope the war ends. But he'd gotten some kind of award from the Russian government years ago, but he hasn't said anything that they could find. The New York Times did a whole story on it. They couldn't find anything he'd said that was pro-Russian or pro-the Russian war, and it's another one of those Russian cancel culture stories.
Yeah,
I'll probably talk about it in more detail.
You're completely
tomorrow.
right about the tone, the tenor of speech rights in Europe being really, really cold. There was a story in The Intercept earlier this week about German media giant Axel Springer saying that "From the River to the Sea" is a verboten statement. Obviously in the context of Palestinians, and then running ads in their own paper from Israel that uses that exact phrase, "from the river to the sea." And so there's there was, I think especially in Germany, because of the history of the Holocaust, a real shutdown on pro-Palestinian speech in particular. But you're seeing that is enabled by this broader culture where there just isn't the same kind of protection for First Amendment protected activities. And I think you're right to point out how that seems to be affecting journalists who are advocating both for Palestinian interests and who want to do even a basic interview with the president of Russia. I did want to ask also what you described earlier as, well, sometimes you do a fluff interview to get a more substantive interview. I mean, another word for that is access journalism, and that gets the obvious critique. I remember we covered a interview between Kamala Harris and Katie Couric recently, where after a tough line of questions from Katie Couric, Katie says, well, now we're going to go talk about some more positive things the campaign, and Kamala Harris goes, good. At the end, and it did kind of give the impression that she said, look, you got to have to put up with me for these few minutes of tough questions, and then we can move on to easier things. That's not exactly the same thing as access journalism, but should we be concerned if that's the case, if the only reason that Tucker Carlson might have been able to get Putin in front of a camera where Christiana Amanpour cannot is because there is some kind of a guarantee that he's not going to go there?
Yeah, I mean, if he can't go there at all, then it's obviously not worth doing if there are so many conditions put on it. I mean, interviewing people is difficult. We do it sometimes. Everybody has journalists have all sorts of different styles when it comes to it. Sometimes you want to just really go after the person and burn bridges and make it so that there's no way this person would ever consent to an interview with you again. Sometimes you hope that they'll come on again on your show. They'll talk to you again in the future. So you want to, balance it out in some way so that you can be in a position to interview that person again. And it's all about trade-offs, and it is a difficult thing to navigate. And some journalists do it better than others. We try our best. I know when we had Fauci on, Batya and I interviewed him a couple years ago. A lot of people thought it was not harsh enough, given how much we had condemned him and criticized him. But I wanted the opportunity to maybe interview him again. I think we actually asked him tougher questions than he almost ever got asked in any sort of mainstream or cable news, corporate news context, and I'm very proud that we did that, even if it wasn't, he logged off in fury and anger, cut the interview short. That was, I decided, not going to be ultimately productive, but people could disagree.
Yeah. Well, let us know what you think, and stick around, please, because we have more Rising for you coming up shortly.